Before I start off, introducing Robert, I hope some of you will have met Robert in the hallways already. Let me do the territorial acknowledgement that we do acknowledge with respect to the Kwana peoples and on whose traditional territory the university stands in the song uses Kwana and the Saanich people, whose historical relationship with this land continue to this day. Yeah, and if you think about the week we are in at the moment, at the end of the week, we have the National Day Truth and Reconciliation, so lots of events going on campus, and I would like to invite you to consider. I think there's one on Thursday morning, central event at the library. But even throughout the week, we have lots of events that try to shed light on the legacy of colonialism, the residential school system, the treatment of First Peoples in Canada, but also remind us what the TRC has called upon, basically a call to action, what universities can do as well in trying to do justice to the legacy of First Nations in Canada. So we will do this in different ways at the center, but there are already things. Matt and I last night went to a great event by Connie Walker, and she is a CBC journalist who produced these podcasts. And maybe we put this into a link to the center fellows. And also it was an opportunity for Ryan Moran from the library to launch his podcast series on past injustices, and you'll see those. So there are lots of resources made available to learn about the legacy of colonialism and the truth that must be told in the Canadian context. So we're going to follow up on this. But now, is it me? No, you switch with this. It's my great pleasure introducing Robert more fully. And you look at his CD, he is as global as the center, in terms of its placement. Most recently, I've been a research fellow at the University of Tampere in Finland, but before this, a long time spending as a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle, which I just learned is 2 hours north of Sydney, and the real Newcastle. So I think we're debating what the real Newcastle is. But from a decolonial perspective, I agree it's the Australian one. And prior to this, and this will be part of Robert's focus today, he also lived in Budapest and is a native speaker, or definitely a speaker, and very knowledgeable about Hungarian politics and society. And when I looked at Robert's publications, that's another element that could have been a driving force, bring you to the center, very multidisciplinary and broad-ranging interest, trying to link political theory with political communication, focus on political violence in the international arena, but also linking local and global realities in terms of understanding what is going on in terms of preventing violence, but also being a very sharp observer on the media and what role media plays in instigating conflict and in shaping politics. So it's a great pleasure, Robert. You jumped in very early in your stay here to present. Let me go back to the title, or you could. There is everyday nationalism in Hungary, constructing utopia in the Carpathian Basin. So welcome to the center again, and I'm very curious to hear what you say about everyday nationalism. A very timely topic. Floor is on this one.
Okay, thank you. I'm wearing the same shirt as I wore in the picture. I did that on purpose so people didn't get confused. I've got a PowerPoint, so let me do that. Just so it's just organized that way, so I feel it's a lot better. Close this. So. Sorry, we were testing the PowerPoint. Okay, so let me get into this. I'm just going to dive into this. This is a bit of a forever problem for me. I've been working on this for quite a while. So I'll just dive in and let's see where we get to. There's a bunch of words which I will speak to, and then I have some pictures that are things that I've taken off various bits and pieces, and I'll explain that as we go through this. So let's just get into this. I wanted to. This is a piece of what I've been thinking about in terms of different kinds of solidarities, and being a political theorist and political scientist, that makes me one of the most obnoxious people around. So I always think about this in the other way. You know, people always talk about solidarities and think about them as being something that is positive and you know, building communities and things like that. But there are some bad communities. There are communities that are things that have developed in a completely different direction. And when we start to talk about far-right groups, far-right politics, I think that that's what's happening. So this utopic idea, this idea of a particular utopia in the Carpathian Basin, is this new version of solidarity that's building a kind of right-wing alternative, a resistance to a particular type of globalization. And this has been going on for a while, and I'm going to show you some of the characteristics of this. This is why I talk about this as a kind of epistemic periphery in political theory terms. I like to use this, I like to think about this as an epistemic periphery, and I'll show you a couple of positions on this in just a moment, as well as this concept of stigmatized knowledges. So this idea, for just as a quick example, which is something that underpins much of this, just as a quick example, the idea that the Treaty of Trianon at the end of the First World War is an illegitimate treaty. So it's a kind of reversing this concept that we have to adhere to whatever types of boundaries and borders exist on the planet today. This idea is clearly a type of stigmatized knowledge, or viewed as a stigmatized knowledge, right? Because the idea is that we're supposed to accept those boundaries. In this context of Hungarian speakers, it has become a mainstream idea that these are illegitimate borders, and it is not the case that Trianon is somehow a legitimate set of treaties that end the First World War, and we need to do something political about this. So this is part of this. I talk about this everyday nationalism business, and there's a bunch of people have written on this. Antončić has written on this, Midley, Kondo, and Lidler, and others have used this idea. And I want to show you some of those symbols and how these kind of mundane symbols build around mundane practices, and then we have a kind of commonly understood imagery that then drives and builds these alternative forms of nationalism. So just real quick, I don't want to do this too much, but just real quick. So in practical terms, this represents 3 different articles, and then there's ultimately a book that I'm writing on this. So there's a bunch of material here, and I've tried to condense this into this. If there are any specific details that people want to ask about, please do that. Just even if it doesn't seem to fit somehow into what I've done here, because I've tried to amalgamate a bunch of things. So you know, if you have a question, just shout it out. So let's see if this is even interesting in any way. So I want to talk about this. I want to point out 2 contrasting views in the very beginning. Let me just do that real quick. There's a whole bundle of assumptions that were competing around the mid-late 1990s around this question of peripheral Euro states. Hungary is one of those states. So as the EU is expanding and NATO itself is expanding, and all of these things are changing at the end of the Cold War, there's a bundle of assumptions that people are arguing about. One of those things has to do with how to classify and categorize co-ethnics in this new changing state of Europe. So how do we classify and categorize people who are somehow co-ethnic or co-Hungarophones or something around this, people who are not sharing the same nation state, people who are not sharing indeed, and I'll get to this later, indeed, people who are not sharing the borders of a nation state that is considered to be legitimate borders. So there's a whole big argument that still goes on, like right now. So this isn't something that we have solved. And in that time frame, in this time frame of the entire decade of the 1990s, there's pretty much no discussion whatsoever around migrants. This idea of migrants and immigration and this kind of stuff that is so powerful today in East Central Europe, that is certainly so powerful today in Hungary in particular, and in the Hungarian-speaking minorities in other parts of Europe, that did not exist. The conversation was always framed in some kind of European home. If you look at a bunch of these, I was working at a couple of universities in the late 90s in Budapest, and if you look at how the universities themselves were sort of advertising themselves, attempting to internationalize and do all of those things, they always talked about being in Europe, being part of a European home, welcoming people from all over the world, you know, saying this kind of stuff. That was the sort of rhetoric around this, which is completely different now. It's a totally different thing. So I'm not saying, and I just want to clarify this as well, I'm not saying that there was no presence of a far-right ideology. I'm not saying that at all, but the discourse was quite different. Overt fascism and irredentism was rejected quite plainly. And then there is this development of a questioning of this new global order in the 1990s, this end of history thing that was so arrogantly postulated by some political scientists was certainly something that was questioned. And I say questioned, but it wasn't just questioned, it was rejected. It was something that was actively beginning to be resisted. So I want to just say this, I wrote this in, one of these anecdotes, so I don't forget. There were regular and constant attempts to raise far-right movements in the Hungarian context. And they constantly and regularly also stalled through the 1990s. This feeling of European solidarity was still there. I remember quite clearly on almost a daily basis when I would be walking to work, I would regularly see people with megaphones or those old amplifiers that we normally use for like a guitar or something like that, standing on the street corner somewhere in Budapest or outside of a subway stop, coming out with some central subway areas. And coming out of the subway, people who were trying to bring together some sort of far-right slogans and things like that. And I remember quite plainly there were people who were looking sort of grandmotherly with shopping bags who would stop in front of them and start, wagging their fingers at them saying, "What are you doing? You should be ashamed of yourself. You pack up and get out of here. You're not playing music. Why don't you do something useful with your life?" These kinds of things. This was a regular thing to see in Budapest. So this idea that this far-right thing was a powerful movement or something like that is not the case. It is not the case in the 1990s. It's really after 9/11, and it's really after this entrenching of the surveillance state that the revival of nationalism then takes on a different character. Everything changes around 2003, 4, 5. It's then that we see something quite different when the evocations of everyday nationalism change in character. So having said that, I would say that in the first Orbán government, from 98 to 2002, they were not successful in delivering some kind of far-right program. That didn't work for them. The growing kind of concepts around the far-right groups and things like that, the Fidesz party and Orbán itself, they were really kind of in the background. It's not until the early 2000s that this kind of stuff starts to happen, and the crest of the wave that they eventually ride is something that delivers them, 4 election victories in a row, and then they do all this sort of stuff. And I do want to say, I have 2 other things, a small anecdote before I get into some pictures and analyses. one about Finland and one about Slovakia, but I'll leave the Slovakia one till the end, maybe if we have time. But I do want to say something about Finland really quickly. So I moved to Finland, I don't know when, 5 or 6 years ago, something like this. And by that time, this idea, this type of far-right ideology is deeply entrenched in Hungary, but it's also deeply entrenched in Finland. So if I do this thing where I would step outside of the university context, step outside of that and do, everyday life stuff, go get a car fixed, or, it doesn't matter, any sort of everyday life thing that you would normally do, trying to interact with people, learning the Finnish language, speaking Finnish. If you are a Hungarian speaker and you start to learn Finnish, then your accent is almost perfect. Because, as we know, now I'm going to say something ultra-nationalist, right? Hungarian is one of the most complex languages on the planet. It's a superpower to speak it. It covers all the sounds. It covers all the sounds that a human being can make. This is a far right. This is an actual far right platform that people say this. So if you're learning Finnish, and I have said this to Finnish people as well, because I'm an obnoxious political scientist. I have said this to Finnish people as well, that Finnish actually sounds like a primitive version of Hungarian, which is fine to say because they seem to find it funny, or I'm still alive anyway. So you can do this. You can do this as a Hungarian speaker and start to learn Finnish, and then there is a conversation that begins around this because you're obviously quite limited in what you can say and do as you're learning the language. And then you would tell the guy who's fixing your car, actually, that's the limit of my language because I speak Hungarian, so I'm learning the language. And then they start telling you how great this Orban policy is and how fantastic this idea is and how the cohesiveness of an ethno-national state is the way that Europe should be going. So this is a constant, regular theme that I find when I'm interacting with people in Finland. The Slovakian one's different. I'll say one more thing about the Finnish one. Because we're all friends here, right? So I can say the bad stuff too. So I'm just assuming that. After I've been in Finland for a couple of years, I have a colleague that I work with. We published a couple of things together, and we're still working on some stuff too. So this colleague of mine and I we were using bad judgment, and we were at a bar that's quite well known for selling alcohol quite cheap, and then thus attracting a lot of far-right people. And so this is a kind of a regular occurrence in Finland, which is a weird thing. I'm not sure I can explain it, but it's a regular occurrence to be, if you're sitting there, you're not speaking English or Swedish, then you will get accosted at some point. People will ask you what language you're speaking. So it's a kind of weird, I'm not sure why this happened, but it's happened to me quite often. And this colleague of mine, who also speaks English, but when we get together, we often speak Hungarian, and we were in this bar saying stupid things in Hungarian very late at night after too many drinks. And so a couple of far-right guys come over. They're obviously far-right because they've got, a couple of tattoos and some, stuff pinned on them, things like that. And they started asking us what language is that, and I immediately jumped in and said, well, it's actually none of your business, so get the hell out of here. So my friend, who's actually physically quite larger than I am, he's shaking his head and he's, telling me, why do you always do this? You always get us in trouble, and so it was this sort of discourse, and he's yelling at me in Hungarian, and then two more guys come back and say, okay, now you got to tell us what language is that? And I said, still, I'm not telling you, I'm not saying anything. So you need to go away, you need to leave us alone. We're going to finish our drinks and whatever. So it increases in number. So then now it's 3 or 4 guys. Now they're standing around the table. It's just me and my friend. And then these guys are saying, look, we're not letting you go. You have to tell us what language this is that you're speaking. So I turned around to those guys and I said, actually, it's Hungarian. And our problem is not with you personally, but our problem is with the entire Finnish ethnic cohort. We sent you guys north 700 years ago. You never came back. So now we're here to claim our land. And now we're here to actually claim our resources. Yeah, well, this is
barbecue.
Yeah, this is my friend's reaction. This is my friend's reaction. And so it was really funny to see this kind of reaction of these guys. They're like standing there going, wow, what do we do now? Like, what is it that we do? So they kind of went back to their table and kind of counsel, they had a council. And then they sent over, there's a thing where they sent us a few shots of fisu, which is fisu means little fish, and it's licorice melted in vodka. So it's a particular kind of vodka. It's really quite disgusting, actually, but so you can drink this. It's like this minty, licoricey kind of stuff that you would drink with it's like vodka. It's really quite disgusting. So they sent us a couple of shots of those, and then they're just waving at us, idiots. Just waving at us, yeah, okay, all right, you guys are okay. So my point of this thing is that it's quite interesting to see how these new types of solidarities are linking up in some odd ways. The Slovakia one is a different one, which if I have time, I'll talk to the end. It's kind of the opposite of that. But this is something that I would argue has changed in the early 2000s. It is not the case that places like Finland and Denmark and Sweden are these sort of open societies with, this social democracy that people often assume they are. In fact, it's something quite different. But I'll leave that for the moment. There's a particular kind of revival here. If you look at the picture, this is just something from one of the Facebook groups that we're looking at. And so there is this very particular set of symbols. If you see, there is an attempt to build in one way, a traditional romantic nationalist mythic past, and it's very much a mythic past, trying to deliver this particular type of populist response to this resistance to globalization and various interpretations of EU membership. So this set of symbols you will see all over the place. I'll just quickly run through a couple of things. The gendered aspect is quite obvious, and I'll show you a couple more other ones. The gendered aspect is just that the standard thing that women are supposed to have Hungarian babies. So it's a very standard kind of thing. If you look at this one, the map is outlined, so the map of Greater Hungary, which becomes ubiquitous, which I will talk about also in some detail in a moment. So that shape that is on the field, that is actually the map, that is where the crown is inside it. You'll start to recognize that in a moment, because I'll go through and I'll show you other versions of that. There is a bird that's up in the right-hand corner, which it's a kind of a hawk. I'm never sure what this is supposed to be in English, but it is a bird, bird of prey or whatever in quotation marks. This turul modar. The turul is a type of bird that is a formative aspect of these sort of mythic concepts of how the nation is founded in the Carpathian Basin. And then there's all this stuff. There's always this stuff about bread. So there's always this stuff about bread and wheat, which is down in that left-hand corner. And then there's some sort of concept of original costumery, which predates the European idea of this kind of thing about 1700s, 1800s costumes that people would wear, which is pretty much standard all over Europe. I mean, they all look the same, and I do like to say that late at night at pubs as well. They all look the damn same. So it is a good way to annoy people. This one is supposed to be predating that. So that thing on the left hand side. which is supposed to look like something that is a Trans-Caucasus or some sort of Central Asian thing that is supposed to blend a bunch of different groups. But that's quite a standard theme about the mythic homeland, and I'll take this apart piece by piece in just a minute. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about this in terms of an actual geographic location. So this is what this is, this Carpathian Basin. It's often referred to in God's country, a particular kind of gold mine or something like that, or it's often referred to as a geographic location in which is perfect for human beings to go and live in. So it's very weird when you start to see some of this stuff that comes out of these groups, and that's how this concept of Greater Hungary is formulated. So this idea of the Pannonian Plain or Pannonia or this Carpathian Basin, it's more Carpathian Basin in the last 20 years rather than Pannonia. Pannonia takes it back to Roman times. That's where the name originates from. So they want to do something different. And this is this particular civilizational argument. And this particular civilizational argument is now ubiquitous. It's in all this, it dominates all of these social media outlets all over the region. And it is this kind of special nationalist resistance that has developed this particular solidarity. The discourse is about this Austro-Hungarian Empire being the modern manifestation. I know it's we're talking about the 1800s, but that's not how it's talked about. This modern manifestation of something that is really a predetermined destiny. The idea is that this is supposed to be now a great people, and then recently, in the last 15 to 20 years, it's not only a great people, but a great white people and a great ungay people. So this stuff is really, that's the new part. The white part and the ungay part is this new part that has come into this type of solidarity. And there is this point of understanding with Putin's civilizational discourse. So this is an important point. If you sort of follow the mainstream media or looking around at how people are trying to analyze what's going on, Orban and the far right in Hungary have a clear point of understanding with Putin's civilizational discourse and the way in which they think that they have constructed the European continent in their own minds and how this civilization is supposed to operate. So they would agree, and I have heard this for well on 25 years, that Ukraine is not a legitimate state. So this is not a new thing. It is not a new thing to have heard people talk about it in this way. This has been going on for a long time. And the far right in Hungary agrees with this statement. And they would say that there is a clear reason why. They would point to particular maps and go back to a particular time frame. So they agree with this. There is a similar thing about Slovakia as well. So Polish far right, Hungarian far right, and to a great extent, what's going on in Czech Republic as well, or Czechia now we're calling them, they would agree that Slovakia is not a legitimate state, but not only that it's not a legitimate state, but there's no such thing as a Slovak ethnicity. So there is this whole big discourse around this. So the reason why it aligns quite neatly with Putin's version of Ukraine is this particular civilizational discourse. And this is why Orban and the far right in Hungary are so closely aligned. And there are practical reasons for that too, I know. So there's stuff about petroleum products and things like that. I know there is, but in this civilizational discourse, this is where they agree. The way that this is then put together is really about this amalgamation, this amalgamating into one special race, this race of Hungarian-speaking people. And it's always Hungarian-speaking, and there's this whole discussion around this. there's a linguistic discussion here too, because there's no particular word for this. It's framed in a different way, but there are a lot of languages like this that do this, that conflate this concept of race and some kind of, and maybe genus or something like this. I mean, in Finnish too, it's the same. If I have a dog, so if I'm walking around with this dog, it's a mix of different things, then someone will come up to me in Finnish and say, "What race is your dog?" Because there's no other word for it. So there's so it's flipped around, and so it depends on what sort of mood you're in or how you want to respond to that. So my dog happens to be black, so I like to say,
Oh, no.
yeah, okay, I'll stop there. All right, I'll stop there and go on. So you're getting into the spirit of this. Now, yes. So this is the map. This is the shape of the map. I think I could even make a case about saying this is kind of the entry point into discussion around this. So this is a bit of a weird one. This map is an esoteric thing to talk about in the 1990s. You would go to like the National Museum or something like that, and you would be able to get prints of the map, and then you can still get divisions of where so-called Greater Hungary might have been at any point in time in history, something like this. But it certainly was not a ubiquitous symbol. This, as it stands now, is a ubiquitous symbol in Hungary. You will see this everywhere. And in this new, I want to link this back into how solidarities are built and how we talk about surveillance and surveillance when we're surveilling each other. You need to have one of these things somewhere. So you've got to have it mostly on your car. So you need this on pretty much every car now has it. And it's kind of interesting that in the early 2000s when Hungary was then moving to join the EU and then joined, for lots of license plates when you started to get the EU license plate on a car, lots of license plates would have, the EU, European Union version of the plate, and then they would have this irredentist flag that's sort of attached onto the corner of it saying, well, this is Greater Hungary. So it's kind of a strange development. This is now literally everywhere. So window stickers, schools will have them. Schools will have a Greater Hungary map somewhere, like in the central area somewhere when you walk in. Parts of Romania do this. I've been in schools in Hungarian-speaking places in Romania, which will be the same thing. You kind of walk into the school. It'll be a big stone building. Somewhere quite prominently, quite quickly, you will run into this map, and a detailed map. So not just a little sticker in the corner. I'm talking about a big one, like a chalkboard-sized one that's stuck in the thing with all the different, provinces of Greater Hungary, stuff like that. The shape of this map is known universally by everyone who is a Hungarian speaker. So, and it's a de facto rallying point. You will see this everywhere. It is a deeply irredentist claim, and there's a claim that would be inclusive, and I've listed them just in case we're confused. It would be inclusive of all of Slovakia. There's a piece of Serbia, which is, well, it's interesting on its own because it's always, all, quote unquote, always being a multicultural place. We can quite safely say that a multilingual, multiple types of worship, all of that. There's also a small piece of Slovenia, there's a small piece of Croatia in the south, and then there's a piece of Ukraine as well. The piece in Ukraine is they didn't quite do the same thing in Slovenia, but the piece in Ukraine is quite well known now for having a good decade of Hungarian-speaking schools. And the Orbán government dumped a whole bunch of money. So if you want to find the best school with the best sports facilities, best field, soccer field somewhere out there, then you would take your kid to a Hungarian-speaking school. So they've done this on purpose. Those schools are much better equipped than a number of other schools in Eastern Hungary. which is relatively quite poor. It's kind of East and West Hungary divide like North and South Italy, kind of. It's almost the same concept. So Ukraine, there's this piece of Ukraine as well. Then there's this whole other argument about Austria as well, because there should be a piece of Austria. But that is another story. It's another complicated story. And another late night bar fight to always get into is to say, you can keep all those other crappy areas of old Hungary. I'll take Burgenland, which is this wine-growing region of Austria that is. It's also another way. I've got a list of these things that you can, if you want to get into a fight. Hold on, list.
Would be interesting to go drinking downtown with you.
Yes, yeah. Of course, the largest claim is Transylvania. So that is that is a big chunk of Romania. That is the largest claim. And there's a whole big argument about this that we can get into whether or not any of these claims are legitimate. But these are clearly irredentist things that come from the map itself. So this map then is used as a kind of ethnic beacon. And this is how this solidarity is built. Everybody agrees on this. And that's also a dangerous thing to say, because now it is quite difficult to find, for example, political party platforms that are outside of this somehow. It's very, very difficult to now navigate this, because it's seen as some kind of immediate accepted fact. The Carpathian Basin then becomes this quite powerful tool for this reinvented brand of nationalism. It's pervasive in the region, and it cuts across all kinds of boundaries, gender, class, religion, and it creates this particular kind of super-ethnic category of Hungarians. Even though this is a historically inaccurate claim, not only is it a historically inaccurate claim, but the explanations of how nation states developed in Europe, even in Hungarian-speaking historical accounts, are saying something quite different to what this new version of nationalism is saying. So they had to actually rewrite all of this stuff. It's really fascinating that it's been so successful. Part of it also is there is this other thing about this return to village life, you know, which assumes some kind of single unified ethnicity. So there is this part of this, which is clearly in opposition to neoliberal capitalism. It's not unique to Hungary itself to make these claims, and it's not even unique to make them in any sort of geographical way. So this is a quite standard picture again, and also a relatively standard slogan. I've seen this all over the place. You can occupy a homeland with other means besides weapons. This so-called demographic question, or whatever this is, this pops up all the time, especially in Pennsylvania. And there's a big argument about this. There's a great deal of social pressure put on people to have bigger families, more children, all of this sort of stuff, because demographically, you know, most of Europe is in the same sort of so-called demographic situation where people don't have big families. So there is this kind of pressure constantly on this, and you would see these sorts of slogans are all over the place. So you'll see this sort of thing. You can notice there's a baby in the tricolor, Hungarian tricolor thing up on the left-hand side, and then it's always a pastoral scene, right? So it's like vineyards or some sort of forest area or something like this, and then there's always this. There will be some sort of formation of a woman somewhere inside that kind of pastoral scene. So this is how this is supposed to be operating. And this is how these various ideologies then coalesce into this space, a kind of resistance of the type of capital that the EU has brought into peripheral places like Hungary. It also encompasses eco movements. So the kind of eco movements and the green movements that have existed in these places are also quite similar to this. All kinds of stuff about Christian religion, religious varieties, These replacement theories abound, so there are tons of these replacement theories, and then it ends up being a particular kind of reworked version of this neoconservatism, which includes some, this particular definition of tradition and family. And this is how, it really almost out of nowhere, this is how this LGBTQ plus movement eventually becomes a threat to the state. So this was never a threat to the state in particular. There may have been arguments from religious groups. There may have been arguments from particular political parties like Christian Democrats that would have said, well, we're not a political party that talks about this issue at all. We don't actually support the changing status of people in society like this. It became something else. It became an actual threat to the state to then start to talk about people who are gay in some way, shape, or form. It became a threat to the state. Having any kind of rainbow stuff ends up being a clear threat somehow. And again, this is another clear agreement with the right wing in Russia and Putin's Russia. It is very, very similar in Poland, very similar in Ukraine, similar in a lot of places. And so Orban and these guys have managed to do this sort of thing. It also includes weather reports. Anton Chichen and Salka have done a nice little article on this where they talk about weather reports. So that also changes. 30 years ago, if you're sort of walking around minding your own business in Budapest and you want to get a weather report in a newspaper, it's not going to be a Carpathian Basin weather report. But today, almost always, it's Carpathian Basin weather report. So, and that encompasses a whole bunch of countries, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the boundaries of those nation states are. The weather today in the Carpathian Basin is going to be favorable for ethnic Hungarians. So this is how it's reported. So really kind of an interesting shift, and it fits into this logic quite neatly. And there's this whole big rewriting of policy as well. And the rewriting of the policy takes the cornerstone being this geographic place. And I'll show you just a quick example of that in just a moment. This is a kind of pro-family movement to bring to the world one more Hungarian movement. And then it's the map, right? So again, this is the shape of the map. So if you're a Hungarian speaker, you immediately see the map. So this is something that just always, you can immediately see that. So you know what they're saying. They're saying, yes, we need to populate the Carpathian Basin again. This is just a quick example about something that's clearly shifting policy wording. This is this basic program of kindergarten education. It's inside this policy document, and I've just translated real quick. So there's if you read where it says number 4, because it's section 4 where they open section 4. So the idea is here again that it's about Hungarian language institutions in the Carpathian Basin. So they want a kindergarten program that is universal in all of the places, all at the same time, doing all the same things. So this is another kind of irredentist. It's quite easy to do this other kind of irredentist claim that you want to bring this unity, this solidarity among all Hungarians, however we're defining them, all Hungarians. And of course, it becomes official. So this is the official Solvi party spokesperson, maybe 2 years ago, or 3, maybe two, not that long, anyway, not that long ago. So the map is in the background. So obviously this is something that's being set up for an official comment or set of comments. It may not be an extended interview or something like that. And then this is what the office looks like. So you can see how this is all put together, and it just looks very weird. I can't imagine seeing this happening in Canada or something like, it just looks very weird. But This is how this is put together. You can see the detailed map of Greater Hungary, an obvious irredentist symbol. Not only with I'm not talking about the little sticker thing that you put on the window somewhere in the background, right? So it's not even that. Now it's the detailed one from I don't know which one this is. I didn't check, but now it's the detailed one from something like 1848. It's got all of the provinces. It's got all of these things set up inside there. So it's kind of interesting that and this is a constant. This is a constant thing. So this is not a one-off kind of accident where the guy was in his hunting lodge or something like that. This is a constant regular thing. Yeah, it's very weird. I do want to do something in a little bit of detail here. I want to show you some stuff on St. Stephen's Day. St. Stephen's Day has become part of this. It's become part of this whole problem. 20th of August is this particular celebration day. It was a holiday. Was it an obscure one or not an obscure one? I don't know. It's kind of this is something that really began to be celebrated in the millennium, so-called millennium. So Hungary has this millennium celebration, and at the end of the 1800s, and that's when they built the first underground railway on the European continent. So outside of London, the next big city was Budapest. So they built, it's still there. They dug this tunnel from, it's the small underground, the yellow one that goes from the middle of Budapest all the way out to Hősök to the Freedom Square and the big park that's behind it. So they did this kind of straight line there. So it was meant to be this big, anyway, meant to be this big thing. So it's kind of a pre-modern Independence Day that's supposed to coincide with a Catholic holiday of King St. Stephen. And this is supposed to be the king that amalgamates the tribes 1,000 years ago. So that's why that's there. So it's this particular holiday. So, the end of the 18th century, they started in a small way celebrating it. And then quickly after the Treaty of Trianon, it becomes this revisionist propaganda. Yes, I see that term. And this is the message of this unity and solidarity in the Carpathian Basin. This is why they bring in the harvest wreath, so the bread stuff is always going to be there. And it's supposed to, the harvest wreath is supposed to symbolize the actual basin itself. Symbolizes Hungary and Greater Hungary and all of the Hungarians of the world. And there's tons of stuff. There are competitions now. So if you go into the Facebook stuff, there are competitions now where people are trying to make, it's just crazy. So they're trying to make the map out of bread or I know this sounds stupid, but it's true. They're trying to make the map out of, bread and salami and stuff. I know it sounds stupid, but it's an actual thing. So this is how it looks. Usually you would see this, and there's always the bread. So you'll see on the left-hand side where it says Magyar Kenyere, Kenya is bread, and so there's always this symbol of bread somewhere. And then it's very quasi-religious because the bread is passed out. People are breaking the bread and taking a piece and eating it. So it is very quasi-religious. The St. Stephen's Day celebration in the past 4 or 5 years has become something else entirely. They wanted to change this and turn this into a thing that looks very much like what you would see on movies, some kind of crappy TV show that is going to be an American 4th of July celebration. So that's what they want to do, that kind of kitsch style of over the top, all kinds of stuff. And it always connects Christianity, Europeanness, and Hungarianness. So kereszténység, európaiság, and magyarság is connecting all these three things in this kind of this new version of solidarity. And this is the bird, Turul Madár. It's ironically pink, so yeah, it would have been funny to be there and point it out to people that, isn't this pink? Shouldn't this be? This is kind of a gay symbol. There's a lot of gay in this, isn't there? Again, a late night bar fight.
For next time.
Yeah, for next time, late night bar fight. But I think it's just reflecting off. This was part of the fireworks. Like there would be fireworks. I think those are packages of fireworks. However, this is organized, I don't know. But this is that Turul Madár, that bird of prey that they use as that kind of symbol, and it is a kind of far right symbol. This, of course, is Saint Stephen, right? And often depicted like this. It's the double cross. You can't see it on that photo. It doesn't matter. The cross is always the double cross of Saint Stephen, because there's a simple cross and then there's a small one on the top. And in fact, the crown, the Hungarian crown, the cross is tipped on the top of the crown because it's meant to be broken. But anyway, that's what it's starting to look like. Really over the top stuff in terms of St. Stephen's Day. So this is meant to be like some boring Catholic feast day, right? So now it's changed into something else. And then again, well, if this isn't gay, I don't know what is, but a lot of gay here. So it would be great to be able to tell that to people, this sort of far right activist in person. Personally, I would love to do that. So this is part of these sorts of celebrations. There will be, it's kind of a parade, and then it's dragged out to this location, and then there'll be fireworks that is supposed to be doing this kind of stuff. These are some of the old ones, just as a kind of contrast. So it's not, I'm not trying to say that this is a new, completely invented movement. This Trianon question has been around for a long time, and resistance to the Treaty of Trianon itself has been around almost immediately, but it never became a kind of far-right symbolism that it has today. These are some of the symbols that are sort of revived and used again with Saint Stephen. Obviously, Saint Stephen is there. And the map, the ubiquitous map, is in the background again, so it's always there. And it's talked about as the legacy of Saint Stephen to unite the tribes in the great Carpathian Basin. So this is this mythic homeland that's being reconstructed here. And the social media stuff is playing a huge role in it, being regularly discussed in mainstream media. All kinds of actors from, again, I want to use these terms about this epistemic periphery, these terms around stigmatized knowledge, and far-right groups love this idea. So we are the victims here. We are the people who have been kicked around by all sorts of greater powers, and look, we're still here, and now we're organizing. So it really helps this far-right groups and right-wing governments. And this is where this rejection of liberalism comes from. So this version, this kind of idea about illiberal democracy is about this. This is the stuff that it's about. And it really helps to reject these kinds of progressive politics, rejects any kind of, sort of non-organic version of politics. So it really pushes this back. You can quite easily see this in the discourse, sort of, rejecting this kind of politically correct stuff, the ivory tower stuff. They just reject it out of hand. They don't need to have an argument about it. It doesn't need to be anything that's discussed any more than that. So I'll finish here and just say a couple of real quick things in terms of conclusions. So this new version of nationalism has a definite whitening component. When Orban was talking about the Carpathian Basin, it is home for this newly whitened idea of Magyars, of Hungarians. This new idea of the amalgam of a people in this geographic space is quite different to these past formations. And just to real quick, throw something in about Finland. In terms of Finland, it is also the same thing. So the far right does something quite similar in Finland. It is this kind of whitening idea. In the past, Finland was not viewed, Finnish people, Suomalainen, did not view themselves as people who are so-called white. Depending on what historical time frame we talk about, they were the monsters of the north. They were the people who lived in some very odd places. There's all these sort of really interesting maps where you would see, these sort of giants or something like this in the map area that is Finland, and sea monsters in the Bay of Finland, something like this. So they're really depicted as something else entirely. So it is a new version. It is this new version of trying to create this concept. Prior to this, there's a whole other theory about tourism, which links people in the Carpathian Basin to something else entirely. It links people all the way from Finland through Turkey into Mongolia and Hungary as being some sort of Ural people, including Samoyedic and Turkic people. And so there is this whole big tourism theory that wants to link it in a different way. So that goes in a different direction. So it's kind of interesting to see this. It's not dead as a movement. There was this big argument in the medieval revivalist groups that exist now. There was this big argument about this because they want to revive these sort of medieval stuff. So who gets to claim riding on horseback and shooting arrows? Is it the Turanistic group, or is it this new group that is somehow saying, well, in the medieval period we were also white, but we did these kinds of practices? So there is this whole big argument about this. You still see the yurts are always there. At some point in time in the summer, there's a big celebration and people come in, and there's this yurt, and then people come from Mongolia, and then so there's a whole big thing that is connected around this. But Orban wants to reject this. He wants to reject this idea. And that's the innovation of the far right in Hungary. They want to reject this historical connection to Central Asia, and making up this new genus of human beings, this genus Hungarica, so whatever they want to do. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around this. I've heard discourses that claim that the special Hungarian genes are going to make sure that nobody gets fooled. There's all kinds of stuff on this. There are YouTube things on this where somebody talks about this for 45 minutes, how the genetic stuff comes together, which is obviously garbage, but they do it and get people, and so all of this stuff happens. So I'll conclude there. There are other things I can talk about. I didn't talk about the thing about Slovakia or Poland. I'll conclude there and just leave it at that. This is just a fun one, but it's kind of George Soros and the people are always there as
what does it say?
Bad guys. It says George Soros, or Soros, they flip it in Hungarian, is a new attack coming. So, and then the words on the bottom are about, they used to have these nemzeti konzultáció, means people's consultation. So it's just a thing where they were filling out forms about, they would posit a question. They would say something like, do you want your children to be taught by gay people in their classrooms? And then, it would be yes or no. And so these are the kinds of things. So they would have these sorts of questions about this sort of stuff. The ruling political party would do this, and they would make a kind of so-called referendum on it. It's just so I'll end there. This was other stuff that I could have talked about, but I'll end there. I'll stop sharing. So, are there any questions?
That's so great. I mean, growing up in Europe before this term that you described, right, in the 90s, early 2000s, everything seemed to be steroids and everything going towards that European identity, the end of the nation state was a big discussion. And what you present here is a return to not only nationalism, but a kind of national nationalist project that goes far back, and seems to also take us back politically to very interesting, but also something worrying, worrying time. So thank you for this. Who wants to start us off? Could you monitor the agenda? Is there any questions from there? Oh, yes, Sherry first. Then.
So I think my question is kind of about the last point that you made. I'm just curious if there's an actual historical claim to this, what do you call it, like the Carpathian Basin map?
Yes.
Because it reminds me of China's claim in Southeast Asia, because from their perspective, they have been in the region since the 1400s with all their merchants and ports and envoys. So I'm wondering if there are like those kinds of historical connections, or if it's just completely fantasy.
No, there are those historical connections, and you can go down this path for a long time. So there is the map of Greater Hungary. There would be several versions of that map during the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then there would be several versions of what happened. Empires contract and expand. They move around, especially those sorts of empires. So it really it does resonate in that way. And there is a historical claim to this, but again, it depends on how we want to interpret this or where we want to take this. There are Saxon merchants that wander around Europe forever. So are we going to claim the entire Europe is now German or something like this, right? So you can go down this track quite. There's actually a very good book that was put together. There's a collection of all of these maps of the area of Central Europe itself. And if you sort of pull through that book, you can see how the self-categorization of ethnicities change over time as well. So people will claim themselves to be one thing or another, and then that will also change. So it may be immaterial to then start to claim that you have this ethnic connection of one thing and you were there before, something like this. So it starts to, so in historical terms, yes, of course, there is something there. It's quite easy to link, but it's almost like saying, I took one of those what do you call it? 23andMe or whatever those things, I took one of those tests and 15% comes back Italian, so that explains why I love pasta. So, it's a nonsense. It doesn't mean anything, but it's quite easy to have this tangible artifact that does have a historical precedent, and then to say, they took this from us, we want it back. And it's a very easy way to press against globalization, and that's been successful.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk, Rob. I guess I want to ask a question that would maybe be along the lines of like, what kind of political intervention is work like this? What kind of political intervention is a talk like this? And like, so for sake of clarity, I'll be like maybe a little bit provocative.
Yeah.
So there's an analysis here of far right nationalism in Hungary that kind of presents it as kitsch, crazy talk. Look at these people, holy smokes, it's nonsense. And there's obviously like a little bit of that in the kind of sport that somebody adventuresome like yourself might find late night in a bar, kind of responding to some of these provocations with kind of comebacks that really basically, holy smokes, man, you're ridiculous.
Yeah.
Get a grip. And I don't, and obviously like empirically you have to analyze it in this way because that's what it is. But it does have, I guess, a bit of a whiff to it of the kind of social media wars, and it's just back and forth. Let's own the libs. Oh, this, the conservatards, excuse the expression, are really, and it's a kind of a constant provocation. And I guess the problem with it in relation to far-right nationalism in Europe is, especially in Eastern Europe, is that you're responding to people who are basically humiliated.
Yes.
And you see, you know, skinheads from the GDR experiencing unification. It's just completely traumatizing and humiliating. And on a larger scale, that's how a lot of people on the kind of European periphery talk about the EU, right? Like you're not wearing the right clothes, you're not speaking the right way, you don't have the proper cultural codes, you're not progressive. And eventually, you know, the kind of, well, I can't be an equal on these terms. I'm always going to be kind of subpar. And so to hell with them. And I mean, we see this all over the place, right? Carlos Escobar and Narcos, Donald Trump in the United States. People who are humiliated, it's very hard to unhumiliate them. I'm not suggesting, you kind of put your arms around these people and we can kind of love them back into normalcy. But on the other hand, the kind of constant provoking and ha 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 feeds the beast too. So just kind of politically, do you kind of buy that as a critique of where your talk is coming from? Do you see any kind of alternative to a kind of a culture war approach on the one hand versus a kind of love them back into normalcy approach on the other? And my sense is that neither one works, and I don't know what does, but.
I do buy that as a critique. If I write this up as a couple of academic papers, then I think the initial position is that it becomes something that's possibly surprising to people who don't speak Hungarian, that this map becomes a ubiquitous symbol. I think that's the in, right?
Okay.
So that's the way to come into it, to say. And if I'm talking about this, it's 20 years late. So it is a good 20 years too late to have a kind of intervention here that is going to do something about this, because there's an oligarchy established. There's a kind of a mini oligarchy established with Orban and Fidesz who have looted quite well, done this quite cleverly, looted the resources of the European Union and established a semi-periphery industrial state where you have multinational corporations that are mostly European multinational corporations that are, building car parts, but never really have any sort of other kind of say in what goes on. They don't care because they built their oligarchy. How this sort of plays out politically later on, well, I don't know. We'll have to see. But yes, I do buy it as a critique, absolutely. And if I write this up, I would just say that if I write this up as an academic paper, then it would be the idea that it is surprising to see this again. It is surprising to see these sort of standard motifs of pregnant women standing in a wheat field as something legitimate that you would be able to use in this day and age. But it works. It absolutely works. And to have a kind of political intervention is, I think it's maybe too far gone. I think it is something that it is impossible for, let's say if we're just trying to posit something, it would be impossible for social democrats in Hungary to get around this. So it's almost impossible. They would have to solve cohabitating problems that deal with, gaining back territory, which is impossible to argue against. These are our territories. People speak the language there. They're co-ethnics. Why is it not part of Hungary? So this is not an argument that you can break down in any way. Politically, you can start talking about federalisms and how federalisms then can do away with those borders. There is a way to do that, but it's very, very difficult. So the kind of intervention in that, it's hard to do. It's hard to do. Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe building on your question, Matt, because what you see is the use of it's almost arbitrary use of these historic references, symbolism are very powerful in the minds of people, you know, providing a new sense, you could describe as community, a sense of community togetherness. And, you know, building on this, you know, I'm wondering what is driving this, you know, where does this deep desire for community come from? And you've already alluded to some of those, you know, Matt, you described them as people who feel excluded, humiliated, you know, so that could be one driving force here to say those, it's a kind of a class struggle, but in a different way, right? You know, so is it a coincidence that it is primarily in Central Eastern Europe, right? You know, so with the transformation, with the also neoliberal transformation that we've seen in this part of Europe. I'm just wondering, you know, what do you attribute this strong desire for rebuilding an ethno-culturally coded community in this part of the world to?
Yeah.
And I know that's a large question. Could you give us a sense of where you see it? This is, you know, is it just opportunistic by these parties? Yeah, it's very powerful too, right? So
well, my answer is a bad answer. My answer is actually a terrible answer because I would say something like you're not even asking the right question. Because as soon as you say something like this indicates a kind of state of humiliation in this semi-periphery, already the response immediately is no, it's not. We are a great people.
Mm-hmm.
You don't even understand what you're talking about. So you know this is so you know, there is this disjuncture, and there is this thing here that is a gap that is almost impossible. So I really quickly mention this, and I allude to this in working in the late 1990s in this university in Budapest. I was lecturing, a proper job. I was lecturing, running courses, doing this sort of stuff. When those universities would advertise themselves and the kind of list of stuff that they would do in terms of their internationalization, they would say things like, "We are the home of," and then they would, list the big three classical composers. We discovered vitamin C. So there's all this sort of stuff. You would see this kind of list of these cultural contributions. So this is the empire that never was. This is the great empire that never was. So it's not even possible to start to talk about that in those terms. So this need for solidarity, this need for building this kind of community, it seems like an obvious thing to do. So if you're kind of in the middle of it, it seems like an obvious thing to do. But so if I can add let me add a contrast to that. The Finnish contrast is the same. I was having conversations with people about Finland and NATO accession and all of this sort of stuff. So political science people and talking about this stuff. And a couple of them actually expressed surprise that Finland was so anti-Russian and so ready to jump into NATO, and they were saying things like that Finland has been neutral for this whole time and all this sort of stuff. And I said, well, no, obviously you haven't been paying attention. Finland has not been neutral, has never been neutral. They have a giant army. In comparison to their population, they are a hugely well-armed society. They have the most guns of any European state, because people get their guns and take them home after their mandatory army service. They have this. So I arrived in Finland as a foreigner. I have a child that goes to school there. At the end of, I think it was maybe fourth grade, I'm not sure. She was fourth or fifth grade, maybe something like this. They had renovations being done on their school. It took a while to fix up the walls. It was a few months. It was inconvenient because you couldn't use one of the entrances. It's a big school. The whole wing was kind of blocked off because they were doing stuff or whatever. So at the end of the year, when the kids are coming in for their final report card, the teacher shakes their hand and says, "Good job, whatever, here's your report card." Teacher gives a little thing, and these are, 11-year-old kids or whatever it is. The teacher says, well, we had a trying time with building, redoing the building and all this stuff, but your ancestors and knowing that half of the school, not just half that class, but half of the schools, people who are not Finnish, they're outside of Finland coming in here. Your ancestors also went through the Winter War. We know what it's like. in the face of adversity, and we're tough people, so this is really nothing. It was fine. So it's kind of interesting, right? So that version of community, and that particular version is there. It's ubiquitous. It's very strongly embedded in these sort of cultural motifs. So I don't know how you now start to argue against that. What would you say? You can't go to a bar late at night and tell the Finnish guys, well, you're not so tough, are you? That's a bad idea. So
maybe as a scholarly argument it would fly, but not personally in my case.
yeah.
Anyone else? I mean, I see this, mimicked in Poland, right? So we're
Yes.
more experienced. The very same discourse. It trickles down to everyday discourse. And we're so proud to be Polish, ethnically derived Poland, but we are open also to others. But if you come and stay, right, it will be, you have to assimilate and speak Polish. A bunch of mutual respect. It's interesting. It's a discourse we haven't had for a long time in Europe to this degree, and then that the right wing uses politically, it's more innocuous. But it's also scary to think through the implication of what you say. Once entrenched, right, it's very hard to do away with. Right?
Yeah.
So could a kind of neo-fascist or actually neo-fascist movement like the Fratelli d'Italia in Italy now, use this very term to build something, a kind of a story that can't be done away with, right? There's this kind of nativist discourse about who belongs, right? Yeah, so,
Yes.
or could it be also challenged, right? Probably from the liberal side of the house or the leftist, right? They enforce it. But that's, you seem to be almost fatalistic about, where things have gone in Hungary, and that there's no turning around this.
No, there isn't. I am fatalistic, and but other things too. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to make a change with this. And it's even worse than that because, well, I don't know if it's worse or better, but there are far-right groups and far-right discourses that are incompatible with each other. So far-right Slovakian groups, for example, are ultimately incompatible with both Hungarian and Czech. So it's not possible because they have claims on the same land and they have claims on the same people. So they will argue with each other and say, no, you're not actually X, you're Y. And then, so this kind of thing. So those are incompatible arguments. I'm not sure that that's not a good sign, but it's impossible to make it global. Probably. I don't.
Anyone? Yeah.
I have a question.
Gata, go ahead.
If possible. Hi, I don't know if you hear me, but well,
Yes.
thank you for your talk. And I was wondering, comparing to Poland, and Oliver, you mentioned the facts that, Poles has also those strong nationalism and, for various reasons, historical reasons. I think we have to mention those in order to understand why the same Hungarians. But, I was wondering, how do we know actually how really the majority thinks? Because this is a really big issue. What we realized in Poland when we were there, but also with our Hungarian partners, people don't really open up. They don't really tell what they're thinking because of very, repercussions politically. So, how can we really, in Poland, a lot of people openly say they're very nationalistic, but at the end they know exactly that they're not really great people and they have issues and it's complex and they hate their governments and they hate, even their religious aspects. They're not as Catholic as everybody thinks there are. So there are large groups of this kind of approaches or opinions. And I just was interested in Hungary. How is it there? How do you have a feeling that behind the scenes, people actually say something different, and there's a large group that has a different approach to what we were saying before?
Maybe. So I think that's a good way to put it. It's a good question. What I would say is that maybe one indication would be that it also took the government and it took the Orban government to work hard at this. So they have to actually work at this in order to make sure that people are online somehow with their agenda. So yes, in the background, something else could very well be happening. The religious gamble is a difficult one because that will always fall down at some point or another. So in the Hungarian case, for example, which is quite similar to what happens in Poland, in the Hungarian case, the government has tried to make themselves present in churches, like physically inside churches. So they've said that any church that puts the Hungarian flag inside the church will get X amount of funding. If there are particular types of nationalist symbols inside the church, then you have to adhere to all of those things, and then you will get the funding. So it's this sort of thing. So they do have to work at this because people who are involved in Catholicism, for example, would say quite plainly that there are no nations in the eyes of Christ. Like, this is not a thing. So modern countries are not a thing for religions. So it is that as well. So yes, I think there is something there where people have different opinions, and certainly there is a great danger. The Orban government has always been afraid of people going outside of Hungary to live and work and stay for 10, 15, 20 years, because then they're outside of this sphere of influence. So there is a great deal of diversity there. But whether or not that expresses itself in some kind of change of government or general change of attitude in the country is something else. And I don't know. And I don't even know how you would measure that, because opinion polls don't work. Not like this. Opinion polls might work for, opinion polls might work for like political parties or something like that. But they wouldn't work if you were to say, do you believe we should have this part of Serbia back to Hungary? Well, no one will participate in that because it's already a bad question. So, so there is that. Yes.
Well, I just want to throw in a funny little note, and then I'll let you go. Because I read an article in a Polish newspaper, and it was like, how are the Polish doing in the bed? I mean, it's kind of weird, right? So what kind of belief systems do they have? And is it as Catholic, as traditional as we think it is? And it's amazing. Like, 90% of the Poles were saying, no way, you can do whatever you want in bed, and you don't have to marry. And maybe, like 10% or less than 10% said, oh yes, you have to marry before you have, sex or something like that. But this actually says so much about the society and about their values. So it's kind of interesting to see those narratives that are really different if you approach them from values point of view, or religious, or so you see suddenly a different society. So in this case would be interesting, but I know it's difficult to collect this data in Hungary for sure at the moment.
Yes,
but that's also conceptually, how deep do these signs of political propaganda run in the society, and how do they change attitudes? We see this in competitive party politics, but another part of data, here I just looked at fertility rates in Hungary. They're not above, much above the European average, right? So, this image there of this woman with the Hungarian flag, it's too much work for a German to take, because it was all about giving the children to the Führer, right? There was a real campaign during Nazi Germany, right?
Yes.
So it's eerie to see these images again in the 20th century, or 21st century by now in Europe. Anyhow, so I think we could wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Robert. And
thank you.
That's definitely troublesome to hear, but sobering and important to see the shift in discourse. And I think some of the underlying issues we will address again here in our community, to think about issues of community, of solidarity, that are so much in demand, right? That people, maybe it is also a pushback against marketizing our societies, right? The neoliberalism has run its course, and it has left people without orientation also left behind, right? And who's filling this void? And one answer is the ethno-nationalism that spreads in the Western world. So we definitely come back with this. And you also hopefully are now aware when you go down, have a drink with Robert downtown, be careful what he says. Okay, so that's a word of warning. That one's too serious. Hopefully that was recorded. But Robert, thank you very much for that.